Hi everyone, I'm really glad that I'm online with you all today, and we'll kick off this event with a brief overview of Lynch syndrome basics and an updated bit of information about cancer risk. The majority of you likely have seen this diagram before when you underwent genetic testing, but it may be new for others. Briefly, cancer falls into three main categories. Most cancers are sporadic, happening totally randomly due to a number of causes and at rates that we expect in the general population. Other cancers are familial, where we see more cancers diagnosed in a family than we would normally expect, but we don't find any genetic cause. And lastly is hereditary cancer, which is where we do find a genetic change that explains the pattern of cancers in a family. These genetic changes are also commonly called mutations and officially referred to as pathogenic variants. Lynch syndrome is caused by mutations in the mismatch repair genes and falls into this hereditary cancer category. Our cancer genes normally protect the body against the development of cancer. It's when mutations exist in these genes that we lose some of that protection and our risk for tumors to develop increases. These mutations can either be brand new, occurring for an individual for the first time, or inherited, passed from parent to child, generation to generation. Here we see how Lynch syndrome can be passed down from one generation to the next. However, since an individual has two copies of each mismatch repair gene, there's actually a 50% chance that Lynch syndrome is not passed down to a child and a 50% chance that it is. Here, the individuals in red have Lynch syndrome, and they only pass it on to some of their children. The children that don't inherit Lynch syndrome, those shown in blue, can't pass it on to their own children. Based on the two-hit theory in cancer, a person in the general population without Lynch syndrome starts out with cancer genes that have no mutations in any cell of their body. This example specifically shows two normal mismatch repair genes in the cells of the colon. As an individual ages, one of their colon cells might acquire a mutation. Later in life, they might get a second mutation, leading to the loss of mismatch repair protection against cancer. This then leads to tumor growth as cells in that part of the colon accumulate and more mutations get more mutations and act abnormally. The cells throughout the body in someone with Lynch syndrome skip step one because they already have a mutation. This leads to tumors developing earlier in life and often develop in more locations than just a single site because they're further along in this process. So what does it mean to have Lynch syndrome? It means that you have an increased risk to develop multiple types of cancer. Importantly though, not everyone will develop cancer if they have Lynch syndrome. In some families, we see a lot of cancer happening, in others we don't. Currently, we're not able to predict who will develop cancer and who won't if they have Lynch syndrome, but researchers at Huntsman and elsewhere are working on this. Cancer risks do vary by gene, with MLH1 and MSH2 being associated with higher risk than MSH6 and PMS2. Cancer risk can vary quite a bit for those with Lynch syndrome. While the specific gene involved does play the biggest role in risk level, there are lots of other factors that come into play, including sex, age, family history, personal history, and exposure to various things in our environment. Smoking is actually the greatest known risk factor that can increase the risk for some cancers. As you can see from this diagram, many parts of the body have an increased risk for cancer with Lynch syndrome. However, the greatest risk for both men and women is colon cancer, followed by endometrial cancer for women. I'll be providing information on each of these risk levels, but first I just want to remind you about a couple ways that we can think about our risk for cancer. The most common way you'll see risk levels presented is total cancer risk. This is when we say throughout someone's entire life, they have a certain % chance of developing cancer. While these numbers are applicable for younger individuals with the majority of their life stretched before them, it usually is an overestimate for someone in the middle of their life or even later on. That's because every year we live without developing a cancer, we actually live through some of our risk. So the second way to think about risk is called residual lifetime risk. These two graphs here are residual risk examples for the same person at different stages in their life. At age 20, this individual with Lynch syndrome has a lot more of his life ahead of him and therefore a greater residual cancer risk. The chance he'll get cancer by age 85 is over 40%. However, by age 70, if this same individual has never developed cancer, he's lived through the majority of his risk, and his residual risk to develop cancer is about 15%. I'm going to talk in detail about specific cancer risks now. I'll be using total lifetime risk on the upper end of the risk ranges that are currently available to us, but don't forget about this idea of residual risk. Colon cancer is, again, the highest risk for people with Lynch syndrome, regardless of an individual's gene mutation. As you can see in the graph on the left, risk ranges from 61% for MLH1 mutation carriers down to 20% for PMS2 mutation carriers. However, all of these are above the general population average of 4.2%. You can also see that colon cancer is usually diagnosed at especially young ages in individuals with MLH1 and MSH2 mutations. These average ages of diagnoses can be compared to the general population age for colorectal cancer to be diagnosed at age 67. Endometrial cancer, again, is the next highest risk for women with Lynch syndrome. Here we see a range of risks with a 49 to 57% lifetime risk for those with MLH1, MSH2, and MSH6 mutations, and up to a 26% risk for PMS2 mutation carriers, all of which are substantially increased above the general population risk level. In the general population, the average age for endometrial cancer to be diagnosed is 63, which also is significantly later in life in women with any type of Lynch syndrome. Ovarian cancer is much more rare in the general population, affecting only 1.3% of women. However, with Lynch syndrome, the risk is greatly increased in MLH1, MSH2, and MSH6 mutation carriers, and moderately increased for PMS2 mutation carriers. Again, we see these cancers happening on average earlier in people with Lynch syndrome, often when a woman is in her 40s, while women in the general population usually don't develop ovarian cancer until their early 60s at least. Notably, PMS2 mutation carriers aren't typically diagnosed with ovarian cancer much earlier than women in the general population. The next few risks we'll cover are less common both in the general population and in individuals with Lynch syndrome, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about them. Here you can see that people with MLH1, MSH2, and MSH6 mutations do have a significantly increased risk for stomach or gastric cancer compared to the general population. There isn't enough data available currently for us to estimate stomach cancer risk for individuals with PMS2 mutations though. Again, on average, these gastric cancers are usually being diagnosed at young ages in people with Lynch syndrome in their 40s and 50s compared to the general population, where we typically don't see this until on average age 68. While the risk for cancer of the renal pelvis and ureter is increased for all individuals with Lynch syndrome, individuals with MSH2 mutations, and specifically males, tend to get these tumors much more frequently than in the general population. Again, these cancers are typically diagnosed earlier in life than they do for individuals without Lynch syndrome. So it's in the 40s and 50s compared to the 60s without Lynch syndrome. Here I've summarized the rest of the risk numbers currently available for Lynch syndrome. The risks for the small bowel, biliary, bladder, and pancreatic cancer are all less than 15%. So I've actually shortened the axis so you can see these risk levels better, but the rest of the graphs I showed you were on a 100% scale, and just note that this one's on a much shorter scale. It's actually 20% is the axis. Notably, this isn't a complete list of risks, but we've covered the majority of cancer risks today associated with Lynch syndrome that affect the screening recommendations that will be discussed in the upcoming presentations. Lynch syndrome and breast cancer has been kind of a hot topic in the last few years. While there has been a suggestion that Lynch syndrome increases the risk for breast cancer, this has been disproven by subsequent research studies, which is always hard. You get some research that says one thing and the rest of the research says something else. But conclusively, there is currently not enough evidence to support an increased risk for breast cancer with Lynch syndrome, despite whatever mixed messages you might have gotten. However, if someone with Lynch syndrome has a family history of breast cancer, they probably don't have general population risk for breast cancer and might need to be followed based on that family history, possibly with increased screening. A few takeaway points from this presentation: Lynch syndrome is an autosomal dominant condition. It increases the risk for tumors to develop, but many people do not develop tumors, especially with mutations in the moderate risk genes. People with Lynch syndrome can develop non-Lynch cancers, but it does not mean that specific cancer was due to having Lynch syndrome. Thank you all for your attention.